I should tell you a little bit about my history with gardening and things. You know, when I grew up in Texas, and quite unlike here, you know, in some of the cities in the States, they have these kind of, they call them community gardens more there. So in places like New York, Boston, Chicago, they'll have these community gardens. But in Texas, where I grew up in Houston, even at levels of extreme poverty, most people have some sort of house. You don't have apartments and flats there quite as much as you do in other places. So where I grew up in the suburbs outside of Houston, I did have some green space, but gardening was not something in my family that was really of much interest. I was quite outdoorsy. I was really into camping and fishing and being outside, but I associated the little bit of garden we did have. It was so, it was very basic. It wasn't very, I'm very attracted to wild sort of gardens, lots of color, kind of overgrown. And that wasn't this. The contrast, though, is my great grandmother, my grandparents, they all lived in West Virginia, and I would spend my summers there. And that was a contrast to my Houston life, because my great grandmother, she lived on a beautiful hill, and you would kind of go up this winding path and it would merge to her place. And she had this beautiful, lush garden that she kept her entire life. And I come from a coal mining family there. So she was her husband was a coal miner, again, at quite an extreme level of poverty, but she always kept this. And it wasn't something that was a sort of pastime. I mean, that was where they were growing their food. So I really loved the magic of that growing up, spending time in her garden, having things like fried green tomatoes and turnip greens, real classic kind of Southern recipes, and developing a taste, because in Houston, you know, my mother wasn't much of a cook. That kind of experimenting with food and things was not something that was happening. So when I was in West Virginia, particularly at my great grandmother Nora's house, that's when I got a little taste of the garden. But when I moved over here, I moved to Scotland in 2004. And when I came over, we're living in a tenement flat here. And I immediately was really interested in the mountains and getting out and hiking. And while hiking one day, and this is kind of the first 10 years I was living in Glasgow, while hiking, in the distance, I saw a kind of a collection of huts. And they all were different colors. And it reminded me of, in a way, it reminded me of Austin, Texas, in a way, where you have a lot of wooden houses that are very unique. Every house is different. And I saw it in the distance and I said, what is this place? So I was with my husband, David, at the time when we walked and we checked it out, and we discovered this area called Carbeth. And Carbeth it's a hutting community that really started after the Second World War. It was really trying to get people from the city out into the country and to have some sort of touch with nature. And what I found very quickly discovering that community is the strong tie between allotments here and the working class, and these places that had all been hand built in Carbeth. I mean, it was just such a magical area. And we got a place in Carbeth. Very luckily, we met someone there, and for a few years had a beautiful hut there. Now, interestingly, it was all about the hut and not about the garden. I didn't really venture into the garden. We had space, but it was really about the hut life. And also it's outside of Glasgow. You have to have a car to get there. There's no public transport there. And it was a beautiful few years, but it was completely incompatible with my lifestyle. I didn't got rid of a car. I never want to own a car again. I don't like having a car. And just the kind of getting in and going out, it didn't really feel like it was a strong connection that I wanted to actual nature, to have to actually even get in an automobile to do it. Just didn't seem right. So, and also what's very interesting to discover, if you spend any time in sort of that sort of communities, these sort of hutting communities or country places, you can have a utopian idea that everyone's going to kind of be out there and planting and gardening and working on their hut. But a lot of people there, they wanted their hut to be kind of mini homes in a way. So for instance, I didn't have electricity in my hut. There was a real push. Sometimes people would leave electric cables in our, just in the grass. to try to say you need to get electricity. So you started to feel this sort of pressure to sort of be like everyone else in the community. I thought, no, this is just not working. Then luckily someone that we knew who had had a hut in Carbeth said, there's a great allotment scheme. And up here, as I'm sure it's the same in Manchester, most allotment schemes have like 10-year waits or something ridiculous. They're very, very difficult to get into. But he got us into this place. And this was maybe about 2013, something like that, around this time. And I just immediately fell in love with it. And what happened is with this picture that you saw, that's where I'm talking about, it was finding this combination of having both the hut and the garden space and being able to have both holistically together. It's about a 20-minute cycle, 40-minute walk from my flat. So it's a great, I can just decide on a whim, hey, I'm going to go to the garden for the day. So I like that aspect. I like the journey there and back. And it immediately pulled me into gardening in a way I never expected. Just finally, and again, I was lucky. The people that had the plot before me, it was two women that were doing it together, and they did everything organically. So it was already the ground, the soil, and everything was in good condition. Because what often happens in those allotments too, when you get your first plot, you're given, kind of a garbage plot just to work and see, are you serious? Are you going to do this? So this was really, really lucky, this one. And it's a massive bit of space. And what's very unique about this allotment as well is it's not council owned. It's actually owned by the university because they have their observatories on the grounds. So there's no planning permission issues. You can do what you want. You have as much space as you want. You can have a hut. Having a hut in the city is quite unusual. And if you look at the other allotments in Glasgow, it's not allowed. Most places you're not even allowed a shed, and you're allowed a very tiny amount of space, which is still, I would have accepted that, just having something where you could just grow a few things. But this is just phenomenal. So very quickly got it set up, just doing vegetables, your kind of standard onions, potatoes, garlic, this sort of thing. And it is constantly a challenge and a learning experience, and it's never boring. You really have to surrender to the process in the garden in the same way that you do when you're making work, because what you end up with is never what you said, what you think you're going to end up with. And that is the same with growing. And it changes so much year to year. So I'll have a bumper year for tomatoes, let's say 1 year, and then the next year they just don't grow, and you just have to accept that. It's always this kind of things are in the balance in the garden. And when I'm there, I am truly, I do practice meditation when I'm here, when I'm traveling. I do have a daily meditative practice, but there's something about the meditation in the garden that is very unique and very special. And in some ways, when I'm making work, when I'm making music, I can say that I have my mind switched off. I'm definitely, when I'm doing any sort of creative work, maybe anything in general, it's better for me not to think. I like to keep thinking out of it. So when I'm in the garden and you're working, often I'll arrive to the garden, I'll still have my backpack on. And even before I get my backpack on, I'm on the ground. I'm starting to, get weeds out of the ground, clip things. And, you just become so obsessively involved in the work. And hours and hours can pass by. And I realize I haven't thought about a single thing besides just being in this moment. And so it really keeps me in the moment, the gardening, which is so important for my other work as well. I can be quite obsessive about things, and it's good to have the obsessiveness in my work, but I need other obsessions in my life. And this is something that there's just so much pleasure involved for me, and a deep relaxation, a deep commune with nature as well, I would say. And it hardens your heart working in the garden as well, because there's a lot of wildlife that comes through, not just in terms of maybe flowers or plants and things that don't make it. You'd feel a responsibility. You're sad if something dies, but the amount of other things I've seen in my garden, birds. Last year, was very interesting. First time I've had problems with rats because everything was closed, and those rats that were probably going to, restaurant bins and things in the area, because everything was closed, they started going into the allotments. And that was deeply unpleasant to have to deal with them, but you just do. And the thing with the allotment too is even though it's in the middle of the city, the way it's positioned, it feels like you're in the countryside, and we are right off of a main road. And right now, as the trees and things are still quite bare and they're starting to come and to bloom a bit, you hear some of that road noise, but then they start growing and growing. It's progressively blocked out as the year goes on. And this is such an exciting time of the year too, because, you have that moment in winter when you look in the garden and everything's brown and gray and you can't imagine life coming back. And then it does. And it's, I was just there last week, saw my first bumblebee of the year, completely covered in pollen, looked drunk with pleasure of being in the pollen. The frogs, or the tadpoles, the eggs already laid in the pond, the tadpoles are there, everything's bursting into color already. And that is such a great feeling, especially after the year that it's been this past year. But, in lockdown, this past year, I became particularly obsessed with flowers. And flowers is not something, because, I'm on tour a lot. So the garden is a place that I always spend time when I'm home. But I was away a lot the past 5 years. And because I was here so much, I finally had time to sort of cultivate flowers and grow a lot. And that was really, really satisfying and really exciting.
Which flowers are you fascinated by?
Well, I love dahlias. I started growing dahlias last year, these big bright red ones, and they had these unusual kind of yellow stripes on them that were gorgeous. Anemones, which do very, very well in the garden. I have a heather patch in the garden, a little rock garden with many different types of heathers. Rudbeckia is something that really thrives in Scotland, these big yellow kind of almost sunflower looking flowers that just grow in abundance. Really into herbs there, so do a lot of lavender, thyme, and different types of lavenders, like your cotton lavender and more of the kind of standard purple lavender that people are used to. Thyme, oregano, marjoram, everything. I want to try everything. And this year, because again, like we were saying, I think it could be very similar travel-wise this year, like last year. I don't know how much live playing I'll do or traveling. This is a year I want to experiment with some more unusual flowers, some things that I really need to be here to sort of tend to. So yeah, I have a lot of, one of the things I've always been really into fanzine culture and zine culture. And if you get really into gardening, you get all these kind of great little small catalogs. And it is like the excitement of like looking through old zines and looking at record reviews. I love specialists and craftsmen and this sort of thing. And it's really, I love like staring at these catalogs and circling and deciding what I'm going to do. And another thing I should say about the garden, and this was also very important last year, especially when I wasn't seeing anyone really, is it is a really great community there, and a true community, because I don't think of the internet so much as a community. I think of it more as a network. You are really in touch with people, but there's obviously, for me, a very strong difference between communicating with people online and communicating in person. And what I love about the allotment, again, its history is kind of in the working class. A lot of people that have plots there are still living in housing schemes that are nearby. But it's really a nice diversity of people that live there. And it becomes a real community feel in terms of even bartering, helping each other out, helping each other. You're kind of looking after each other's gardens in a way for each other. And, it's a place where you can just have really warm, open conversations, and you don't have to talk about politics or any kind of the matters of the day. You're focused on the garden. You're focused on everything, so you can spend hours talking about, various sets of onions, let's say, that work. But it's a real, and we're really lucky. They're behind us. There's a couple, Stephen and Jacqueline. They're actually refugees from Zimbabwe, and they have built up this gorgeous garden, and with a lot of kind of vegetables, particularly like African sort of cabbages and things that I'm not as familiar with. So we often will do like trades. I'll give them flowers, and they'll give me, sort of foods. And then it was really nice. A family just moved in next door. It was a plot that was abandoned for a while. At first, I was a little sad because there were some foxes that were staying in the garden that were so cute, and this family moved in, and they're here from Pakistan, and they came, and their son, when he introduced himself, his name is Heather, which I thought was so unusual. I was like, oh, well, this is great. We have 2 Heathers now in the allotment. And it's just, I don't know, I live in a tenement flat. I don't know my neighbors' names. I rarely see them or talk to them, but as soon as I'm in the garden, it's just such a great vibe there, just sort of talking to everybody. And there's, of course, Hallions there too. There's people there that we have a nice little corner, but there's corners of the plot. People are there to party and stuff. It's like the same I was talking about Carbeth. You have people that are there for nature, and then you have people that are kind of wanting to escape for other reasons. So yeah.
So does any of it reflect back into your music and your creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say as far as even as the kind of focus and the sort of mindlessness that I have to have in the garden, I really feel that transfers into my work. The type of music that I'm doing, some of it's improvisation based, but when I'm working particularly on my solo work, my song work, I can't let myself be distracted. And as I said before, I can't let myself think too much. And I think that practice of being in the garden, it's a kind of mind training for me in a way. And there's a physicality to it too, I should say, that I deeply enjoy. And even with the pedal steel guitar, this is a physical instrument. You're very involved with your hands, with your arms. You have your legs in between bars, so you're moving your thighs, you're moving your feet. It's a very physical thing. And I think that also, through the pleasure of the physical, I would find it difficult to just play a laptop or something, for instance. I have to have a physical connection to an instrument or a voice, whatever, when I'm playing. And I think that is reflected in what I do in the garden as well. And, I don't tend to make much work in the garden itself. That's not, sometimes people say, well, what kind of art are you doing there? And that's not the place for it, really. I mean, I have made, I take many, many photographs there, which I do consider a part of my practice as well. And one of the things I did last year is I made a really nice kind of just a small edition book that I just kind of gave to friends with photos from the garden that I've taken. Some of the, that's a harvest right there. And this is just a kind of a private thing. It's not like a book that I sold or something. It was just kind of for close people in my life. And by extension, something that, again, that was sort of a revelation that happened last year with gardening that I became so obsessed with, has to do with this book that Treadwell's put out called Plant Magic. And anyone who has a cursory interest in herbs and plants, I cannot recommend this book enough. It's really, really inspiring. And I got to understand a little bit more about things growing. And a lot of the things in this book actually are growing in my garden as well, which is great. But I got to learn a little bit about sort of magical properties of plants. And I on what I ended up doing, and it's funny that you even said blue, and I immediately thought of the moon, is I made these sort of things last year. A lot of the photos are photos from my garden, with the sort of day of the week and the plants and their different properties. So I do that every day of the week. And I made these, like, this is for today. I've made these, they're kind of like little potpourri concoctions, really herbal concoctions that I made for each day of the week. And all of the things are things that I've dried, that I've picked in my garden.
So what do they do, your concoctions?
Well, they have a nice aroma. So typically when I start the day, typically when I'm making my tea, I'll sort of, and I need to do, these are all cards I made sort of in the fall and winter of last year. And I'm going to make some fresh ones for the spring. So really kind of my process is I'll sort of pull out the card for the day, pull out the herb, the kind of concoction, and it's a type of study as well. So for instance, rosemary is related to prophecy, mint to psychic powers and sleep, rose to love, these sort of things. And I study the attributes. I smell the concoction, look at it, and they have it's such a beauty even in just looking at the dried herbs. And then of course in my own sort of private ritual practice as well, I use these plants and their attributes for that too.
So what kind of ritual practices?
Well, they're quite private things, but they're usually involving some sort of herbs, there might be some affirmation based thing. I should say none of it's I don't do results based magic or anything like that. And it's usually might be related to emotional state or something that's come up in dreams or something that I'm focused on even in my creative work. But again, even with these, it's almost a process where I don't think about it. And it's helping me to notice, even in my day-to-day walks, pulling me into the moment of the flora and fauna that's surrounding me and getting a better understanding of even what's growing all around me. And this sort of study helps me with that. And through gardening, through this practice, you just find yourself paying attention much more to things that you didn't before. For instance, even bird watching has become something for me that's by extension of the garden. I've always liked birds. I've always liked wildlife, but I didn't pay strong attention to different types of birds, for instance. And now that I've been in the garden, I keep looking out my window here at the trees, because the trees here outside of my window have started to become filled with goldfinches, greenfinches, sometimes fieldfares or lapwings will visit at certain times of the year. And before the garden, I would look out the window and I would just say, oh, wow, there are some birds. Even being able to identify all of the different species and see how they interact. And something happened in the garden. This is, again, a new thing for last year. So there's a family of 7 parakeets that are living in a nearby nature reserve. And they fly by, and sometimes they fly into the garden. And so it's just this constant variety of wildlife that I think if you are not idle and you don't just kind of sit and take it in and listen and watch, that you just don't even notice. Most people don't notice that there's probably, if you looked out your window now, there's probably some blue tits or great tits hanging about there, or robin, but you don't pay attention, I think.
So it's the key to all this is really being in touch with yourself and also in touch with nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And feeling a loss of self, I would say, in a way. It really humbles you. You have a kind of humility in the garden where you really realize that your kind of cares and worries and place, even in the worlds, is maybe not as important as you think in some sense. It really kind of is an ego dissolver, I would say. And especially in that garden space when you're feeling a responsibility and a focus on the wildlife that's there. And again, there's such a satisfaction as things start growing and get so many bees and butterflies coming into the garden, very strange varieties of moths and things. And that that's a really good feeling too, to know that you're giving a home for wildlife in the city too, you know.